At the top of a hill covered with centuries-old olive trees lived Dolores, a woman who, despite her advanced age, maintained a firm and serene gaze. A widow for many years and with her children far away, she led a simple life, sustained by the faith that had accompanied her since childhood. Her house, small and modest, was surrounded by a garden that even in difficult times withstood the passage of time, giving her sustenance and joy. Every morning, even before the sun touched the horizon, she knelt before a small altar in her room and whispered her prayers. It was there, in the solitude of the hill, that she found her true companion, God. The neighbors admired her for her generosity. Many who climbed that steep road in search of a word of comfort never left empty-handed. A piece of bread, a cup of hot tea, or simply a sincere smile were offered as if they were treasures. Despite the wrinkles etched by time, her face carried a rare peace. God never forsakes those who trust in him, she would always repeat whenever someone asked her how she managed to live alone in that remote place. Her faith was a shield against any fear, and her heart overflowed with love for those around her. Even in her advanced age, Dolores made a point of caring for her garden with dedication. There, robust fig trees grew, rosemary bushes flourished, and small vegetable beds thrived, which she shared with those in need. But in recent months, something strange happened. The soil, once fertile, seemed tired, and the harvests began to diminish. The work doubled, yet the yield became ever smaller. Perhaps it was age, perhaps the climate, or perhaps it was just another trial sent by God. Even so, she continued her days without complaint, believing that everything had a purpose. The village below the hill was also going through difficult times. The winters seemed harsher, and the land no longer yielded fruit as it once had. Many residents began to question the future, fearing that times of scarcity were coming. But Dolores, with her unwavering faith, remained steadfast. "The Lord will provide," she said, even as she watched her reserves dwindle. Despite the hardships, she never refused help to anyone who knocked on her door. With every morsel of food she shared, her confidence grew, for she knew that true sustenance did not come from the land, but from heaven. However, something was about to happen. One night, while finishing her last prayer of the day, she felt a different wind slip through the cracks of the window. The air seemed heavier, laden with a premonition she could not explain. The old rooster who had been her companion for years remained silent, and her cat, Simo, appeared restless. Dolores stood still, gazing out the window at the dark sky, as if waiting for an answer. And in that moment, a thunderclap shattered the night's silence. The approaching storm would not be just a heavy rain, it would be a true test of her faith. The sky, once sprinkled with stars, closed in with a threatening darkness. Heavy clouds loomed over the village, and the piercing wind blew with unusual force. Seated in her rocking chair, Dolores felt a shiver run down her spine. Her heart, though serene, seemed to sense that this night would be unlike the others. She slowly rose, lit a candle before the image of Our Lady, and murmured a prayer. "Lord, let your will be done." Outside, the first drops of rain began to tap against the window, soft at first, but soon transforming into a dense curtain of water and wind. The wind howled as if trying to tear the little house from the ground. Lightning streaked across the sky, briefly illuminating the landscape ravaged by the storm. Dolores hurried to close the windows tightly, while Simo, the cat, hid under the table. The old rooster, agitated, crowed incessantly inside the chicken coop. When a louder thunder shook the house's walls, she knew that the situation was worsening. The wood of the front door creaked under the wind's pressure, and outside, one could hear tree branches snapping as if they were fragile twigs. In the midst of the storm's chaos, a sound louder than all the rest made Dolores shudder. A piece of the roof could not withstand the force and collapsed, allowing water to pour in furiously. Rain seeped through the house, drenching the earthen floor and the few pieces of furniture she owned. The elderly woman knelt in the middle of the room, clutching her rosary between trembling fingers. Tears mingled with the water streaming down her face, yet she did not cease praying. "Lord, I trust in you," she repeated, even as everything seemed to crumble around her. The storm raged through the early hours of the morning, as if testing the resilience of that little house on the hill. Dolores did not sleep. She remained in prayer, feeling with each thunderclap the presence of something greater. When at last the first ray of sunlight pierced the cloud-laden sky, she rose with difficulty and opened the door. What she saw took her breath away. Her garden was destroyed. The wind had uprooted the fruit trees, the garden beds were waterlogged and overturned, and the fence that separated her house from the road lay in ruins. What had taken years to cultivate was obliterated in a single night. But even in the face of devastation, Dolores did not despair. She knew that everything in life had a purpose, and that God never allowed pain without a lesson. She took a deep breath, pressed her rosary to her chest, and murmured, "So be it." She knew that difficult times would come, that winter would not forgive her lack of provisions, and that hunger might become a reality. Yet something inside her said that this would not be a story of loss, but of renewal. The same strength that had sustained her throughout her life was still there, by her side. And, unbeknownst to her, the answer to her prayers was already on its way. The morning after the storm, silence reigned over the hill. The sky still bore remnants of the dark clouds from the previous night, but a timid ray of sunlight managed to break through, illuminating the waterlogged earth. Dolores stepped outside to assess the damage. With a wooden stick in hand, she slowly walked among the ruins of her garden. Each step was a reminder of the devastation she had endured. The chicken coop had survived, but her crops were destroyed, and the food reserves she kept in an old chest had been ruined by the water. Still, she did not complain. She only murmured a prayer, repeating to herself that God would provide. In the distance, along the muddy path leading to her house, a figure emerged. It was a man in a brown cassock, walking slowly with a serene expression. His face bore the marks of time, yet his eyes carried an inexplicable peace. As he approached, Dolores recognized something familiar in the presence of that friar. He stopped before her, smiled tenderly, and greeted her with a slight nod. "Peace and goodwill, my daughter," he said in a deep, welcoming voice. Dolores felt a wave of warmth pass through her body, as if she were in the presence of someone she already knew, though she had never seen him before. The friar introduced himself as Padre Pio and explained that he was on a pilgrimage through those lands when he felt a strong calling to ascend that hill. "God sent me here," he said simply, as if it were something natural. Dolores invited him in, preparing him a cup of tea with the herbs she still had. As they conversed, he listened to her attentively, as if he already knew everything before she could even speak. When she mentioned the storm and the destruction of her garden, Padre Pio merely smiled slightly and said, "God never abandons us. Sometimes he allows the storm to come so that something new may be born." Dolores felt the friar's words touch her heart in a profound way. It was not just advice, it was a deep truth that resonated within her. Then Padre Pio took a small bag from his pouch and placed it on the table. Inside this bag, there is a little wheat and some seeds. It may not seem like much, but God will multiply everything planted with faith. The elderly woman looked upon that gift with tears in her eyes. It was not merely food or seeds. It was a direct answer to her prayer. She grasped the friar's hands with gratitude, and in that moment, she noticed something extraordinary. Her fingers bore the marks of Christ's stigmata. Before departing, Padre Pio raised his hand over Dolores's head and offered a brief prayer. His gaze was filled with such profound compassion that she felt an invisible weight lifted from her shoulders. "Faith does not save us from trials, but it teaches us to face them," he said, before continuing on his way. Dolores stood at the doorway, watching him disappear down the road, as if he were a vision. That encounter would change everything. She knew it was no coincidence. What would happen from that moment on would not be merely the recovery of her garden, but a rebirth of her faith, her strength, and her mission. That very day, with the seeds and wheat given by Padre Pio in hand, Dolores knelt on the soaked ground and prayed. It was not a prayer of despair, but one of surrender. With tears in her eyes, she thanked not only for what she had received, but also for the storm which, in some way, was preparing her for something greater. With her trembling hands, she began to work the ruined soil, digging small furrows and placing in them the seeds of hope. With each handful of earth she replaced over the seeds, she murmured, "Lord, multiply what I plant here. as you multiplied the loaves and the fishes. At first, everything seemed like a solitary effort. The villagers were aware of the destruction, but few dared to climb the hill. Each was busy dealing with their own losses. Yet something began to happen. First, it was Marta, a widow who had always received bread from Dolores in times of need. Seeing her working alone, Marta ascended with a bucket of fresh water and a determined look. "If the Lord sent seeds, then we must ensure they grow," she said. Then came brothers Thomas and Angelo, bringing tools to help rebuild the chicken coop and repair the fallen fence. News spread quickly. In no time, the hill, once silent and desolate, became a place of movement and hope. Women brought buckets of fertile soil, children helped scatter the seeds, and men erected the posts that had been ripped from the ground by the wind, all because a woman of faith refused to give up. Even those who had not been close to Dolores before began to feel that here, on that small, blessed piece of land, something grand was unfolding. "This is a miracle," some whispered to each other. Days passed, and the land began to respond to the collective effort. Small sprouts emerged, fragile, yet determined to grow. Dolores watched each new leaf with tear-filled eyes. It was not merely a garden returning to life. It was an entire community being reborn along with it. Around the humble table in her house, people began to gather to share not only food but also stories, prayers, and faith. The wind that had once brought destruction now blew gently, carrying with it laughter and songs. Dolores then understood the meaning of Padre Pio's words. God never abandons us. The storm, which had seemed like a curse, was in truth a calling. What began as a tragedy transformed into a blessing. Her garden would not only be restored, but would flourish in ways she had never imagined. And more than that, her solitude was lifted. What was once an isolated house on the hill became a place where faith multiplied, like the seeds planted in the soil. Days passed, and what had once been a devastated field began to show signs of renewal. The first green leaves sprouted from the ground, fragile, yet resilient. The wheat that Padre Pio had brought germinated with surprising speed, as if wrapped in an invisible blessing. Every new morning, Dolores went out to observe her garden with a heart full of gratitude. The villagers continued to climb the hill, some to help, others merely to witness what they called the miracle of the seeds. The impact of the storm was still visible in the houses and crops of the village, yet something had changed. Inspired by Dolores, the neighbors began to help one another, sharing what they had and rebuilding together what was lost. Small gestures of kindness multiplied, creating a chain of solidarity that had not existed before. The baker brought sacks of flour for anyone in need. The shoemaker repaired boots without charge, and even those who had little found something to offer. The faith of that elderly woman had spread like a flame that warms and illuminates. Dolores no longer saw herself as a woman alone on the hill. On the contrary, every morning when she opened her door, she found someone willing to help or simply share a moment of prayer. The restoration of her house and garden became a symbol of what faith could accomplish. When she surrendered to God's will, without despair or defiance, He responded with abundance, not only for her, but for everyone around her. Her home transformed into a refuge, a place where one found more than just bread and water, but also comfort and hope. Padre Pio visited her again weeks later. Upon seeing the transformation that had occurred, he smiled as if he had always known that everything would happen in that way. He sat with Dolores on the veranda of her house, and for a few minutes they remained silent, simply observing the blooming garden. "What was destroyed has come back even stronger," he said, with a serene gleam in his eyes. She nodded, holding her rosary tenderly. It was God who did all of this. The friar then placed his hand on hers and replied softly, "It was your faith that allowed him to act." The entire village recognized that something extraordinary had taken place on that hill. What had seemed to be an irreparable disaster turned into a living testimony of the power of prayer and kindness. Dolores was no longer merely a solitary widow, but had become a spiritual matriarch for everyone around her. And as she gazed at the sky, she knew that none of it would have been possible without the grace of God and the unexpected visit of a humble friar who, somehow, always seemed to appear where he was needed most. The garden flourished beyond anything anyone could have imagined. The seedlings that had once appeared so fragile now stood as robust stalks of wheat, herbs, and healthy vegetables. The fig trees, once battered by the storm, bore sweet and abundant fruit. What Padre Pio had brought, even if it seemed little to human eyes, multiplied in an inexplicable way. The neighbors who helped with the planting harvested alongside Dolores, and no one returned home empty-handed. Yet the true miracle was not found solely in the renewed garden, but in the transformation that occurred in the hearts of the people. The village changed. Where there had once been discouragement and worry over hard times, there now existed unity and generosity. People began to look at one another differently, understanding that God's providence often manifests itself through the helping hands of others. Dolores, once seen as merely a pious widow, was now regarded as a living example of faith. Her house had become a gathering place for conversation, sharing, and prayer. "It is not me," she would always say with humility. "It is God who acts when we open our hearts." Padre Pio returned one final time before departing to continue his mission. He sat next to Dolores and silently observed the village below the hill. She noticed that he smiled in a different way, as if he saw something beyond the visible. "Now they know," he said, without her needing to ask. "Miracles happen where there is faith. And you, my daughter, were the instrument through which they saw that." Before leaving, he offered a prayer for her, leaving an indescribable peace in the air. When he said goodbye, Dolores felt that this encounter would be etched in her soul forever. Years passed, but the story of Dolores and the miracle of the seeds was never forgotten. With each new generation, someone would climb the hill to hear about the storm, the visit of the friar, and the multiplication of the fruits. Some said that, even after a long time, the land there still seemed more fertile than anywhere else. Others, upon visiting the elderly woman's house, felt an inexplicable peace, as if an invisible presence still dwelled there. And those who had known Padre Pio swore that the encounter was not a mere coincidence, but a direct calling from God. Dolores lived her final years, surrounded by love and gratitude. She never felt alone again, for she knew that God was with her at every dawn. And when she finally departed, her story continued to be told, inspiring those who doubted the power of faith. To this day, when the wind blows gently across the hill, some say it is like a blessing, a reminder that miracles happen not only in great events, but in small gestures of love, kindness, and trust in God. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs this message of faith. Subscribe for more inspiring stories of miracles and overcoming. Join our community to strengthen your faith and be inspired by real testimonies.